The little girl had fired 11 maids before noon, but when the 12th woman walked through the mansion gates that morning, everyone expected the same thing to happen again. Nobody expected the person who would finally reach the billionaire's daughter to be the quiet janitor pushing a mop bucket through the marble hallway. And nobody could have imagined that beneath his faded work uniform was a former Navy SEAL carrying a wound far deeper than anything visible on his skin. If you believe kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel so our family can keep bringing you stories that remind us that sometimes the person who saves a broken heart is the one nobody notices. The mansion belonged to Everett Vale, one of the most powerful technology billionaires on the East Coast, a man whose name appeared on skyscrapers, charity foundations, and business magazines. Yet inside his enormous home, wealth had never been enough to make his 12-year-old daughter, Brielle, happy. Brielle had once been a bright, affectionate child who collected pressed flowers and filled notebooks with drawings of birds. Then, 2 years earlier, her mother, Celeste, had died unexpectedly after a long illness. Something inside Brielle seemed to disappear with her. She stopped laughing. Then she stopped speaking. Eventually, she stopped allowing anyone to come close. Every new maid arrived with instructions from Everett's staff, a generous salary, and sincere hopes of helping the child. None lasted. One was dismissed after Brielle threw a glass of water at her. Another lasted 3 days before she quit after finding her bedroom covered in torn photographs. Others simply could not tolerate the silence, the locked doors, the refusal to eat, or the way Brielle stared through people as though they were invisible. Everett hired private therapists, child specialists, tutors, and behavioral experts. Nothing changed. The mansion became less like a home and more like a carefully maintained prison. On that particular morning, a new housekeeper named Marlo Pierce arrived carrying 2 suitcases and a hopeful smile. Everett met her in the grand foyer, explaining that Brielle might be difficult but that she was not a bad child. He warned Marlo not to force conversation, not to enter Brielle's room without permission, and never to mention Celeste unless Brielle brought her mother up herself. Marlo nodded, determined to succeed where everyone else had failed. But before she had even finished unpacking, a vase crashed against the hallway wall, and a frightened housekeeper came running down the stairs. Brielle had locked herself in the library. What nobody noticed was the man quietly cleaning the broken glass. His name was Callum Reeves. He was 38 years old, a single father, and officially the mansion's janitor. He had worked there for 7 months, mostly before the household became active, and he had never asked Everett for special treatment. Callum had broad shoulders, an old scar running beneath his left eyebrow, and a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. He rarely spoke unless necessary. He arrived every morning in a worn blue maintenance van, carried his lunch in a faded metal container, and spent his afternoons cleaning floors, repairing loose cabinet hinges, and fixing whatever the expensive household staff somehow managed to break. No one in the mansion knew that Callum had once served as a Navy SEAL. He had spent years overseas, survived missions that left other men buried beneath foreign soil, and eventually walked away from military life after losing his closest friend during an operation. He never talked about it. He had no desire for medals or admiration. He only wanted a quiet job that would allow him to raise his 8-year-old daughter, Elsie, without constantly wondering whether he would make it home. That morning, while everyone argued about Brielle, Callum noticed something nobody else had noticed. A small paper bird lay beside the broken vase. He carefully picked it up. On the underside was a child's handwriting. It contained only 3 words, "Mom, please come back." Callum stared at the paper for several seconds before folding it gently and placing it somewhere safe. He did not take it to Everett. He did not tell the staff. Instead, he walked toward the library, stopped several feet from the closed door, and sat on the floor. He didn't knock. He didn't demand that Brielle come out. He simply stayed. For almost 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then the door opened barely an inch. Callum remained seated. Brielle watched him from the narrow opening. She seemed surprised that he wasn't asking questions. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater, her hair was untidy, and her eyes looked exhausted for a 12-year-old. Callum quietly placed the paper bird on the floor between them and moved it toward the door. Brielle picked it up. Then, for the first time in months, she looked directly at another human being without anger. Callum stood and walked away. That was all. Yet something had changed. The following morning, Brielle was sitting on the staircase when Callum arrived. She watched him push his cleaning cart across the foyer. He noticed her but did not approach. He simply nodded politely and continued working. Over the next several days, Brielle began appearing wherever Callum was cleaning. She never spoke. She would sit on the stairs while he polished the banister, stand silently in the doorway while he repaired a cabinet, and occasionally follow him from one room to another. The other staff members whispered that Callum had some strange influence over her. Everett noticed too. He became suspicious rather than grateful. He confronted Callum in the afternoon and warned him not to become emotionally involved with his daughter. Callum listened respectfully and explained that he had no intention of replacing anyone. He simply understood what it felt like when adults kept demanding that a wounded child explain her pain. Everett became quiet. Because deep down, he knew Callum was right. He had spent 2 years paying experts to make Brielle talk, but he had rarely simply sat beside her and allowed her to be silent. Then came the day that changed everything. Brielle wandered into the maintenance room while Callum was repairing a broken wooden birdhouse. She stared at it for several seconds before taking a pencil from a nearby table. She drew a tiny bird on the side of the wood. Callum smiled. Instead of praising the drawing, he handed her the pencil and showed her another unfinished birdhouse. Brielle sat beside him. For the first time, she stayed. Later that afternoon, Everett found them together. His daughter was quietly painting the wooden birdhouse while Callum worked nearby. Everett stood frozen in the doorway because he had not seen Brielle voluntarily participate in anything for years. But then Brielle suddenly looked up. She pointed at the birdhouse. And whispered her first word in nearly 2 years. "Mom." Everett's face collapsed. He covered his mouth as tears filled his eyes. Callum immediately stepped back, giving father and daughter space. Everett rushed toward Brielle, but Callum gently raised a hand, silently reminding him not to overwhelm her. Everett stopped. He crouched several feet away and simply looked at his daughter. Brielle touched the little wooden bird. Then she whispered that she wanted to make one for her mother. Everett began crying. Not because his daughter had spoken, but because he finally understood what she had been trying to say all along. She had never forgotten her mother. She had been waiting for someone to stop trying to make her forget. From that day forward, Brielle slowly began rebuilding her world. She started attending therapy again, but this time willingly. She ate meals at the table. She returned to drawing. She began talking in small pieces, sometimes only a sentence or two, but every word was treated as precious rather than expected. Callum remained in the background. He never accepted extra money from Everett. He never used Brielle's attachment to demand anything. He simply kept doing his job and going home to Elsie. Then one afternoon, Everett discovered why. He arrived unexpectedly at Callum's small apartment to discuss a maintenance issue and saw Callum sitting at the kitchen table helping Elsie with a school project. The apartment was modest, with second-hand furniture and photographs taped along the walls. There were no luxury cars, no marble floors, and no private staff. But there was warmth. Everett looked around and realized that Callum had something his mansion had been missing for years. Presence. Callum wasn't richer than Everett. He was simply there. That evening, Everett asked Callum why he had never told anyone about his military background. Callum explained that he didn't want people treating him differently. He had spent years being trained to remain calm during chaos, but after leaving the SEALs, he discovered that the hardest battles were often the quiet ones. Losing friends in combat had taught him that life could disappear without warning. Becoming a father had taught him something else: surviving wasn't enough. A person had to learn how to stay. Everett finally understood. Callum had stayed. When everyone else ran from Brielle's anger, Callum stayed. When she refused to speak, he stayed. When she pushed people away, he stayed. And when she finally opened the door, he never demanded anything in return. Several months later, the mansion felt completely different. Brielle still had difficult days. Healing did not erase grief. Sometimes she became withdrawn when she remembered her mother. Sometimes she cried without knowing why. But now she knew she didn't have to face those feelings alone. One bright afternoon, the entire family gathered in the garden for a small memorial ceremony for Celeste. Brielle had created a wooden birdhouse with her own hands. She painted a bluebird across the front and placed it beneath an old flowering tree that her mother had loved. Everett stood beside her. Callum stood several feet away with Elsie. Brielle looked at her father, then at Callum. She walked across the grass. Everyone watched. She stopped in front of Callum and handed him a small folded piece of paper. He opened it. Inside was a drawing of 3 birds flying together. Beneath them, Brielle had written, "Some people don't leave when you are hard to love." Callum's eyes filled with tears. Everett looked away, overwhelmed. Brielle then hugged Callum. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was quiet. It was genuine. And it meant everything. Everett eventually walked toward them and placed a hand on Callum's shoulder. For years, he had believed money could solve almost anything. He had believed security meant controlling every detail, hiring the best people, and building walls high enough to keep pain outside. But his daughter had taught him otherwise. Sometimes healing did not come from the person with the biggest house, the largest bank account, or the most impressive resume. Sometimes it came from a tired father in a janitor's uniform who understood that broken people didn't need to be fixed before they deserved patience. They needed someone willing to stay. Callum continued working at the mansion, though Everett eventually offered him a position overseeing the family's charitable foundation. Callum accepted only after insisting that the foundation create programs for children who had lost parents and families who could not afford grief counseling. Brielle continued drawing birds. Elsie became her closest friend. And Everett became a different kind of father. He learned to put his phone away during breakfast. He learned to listen without solving every problem. He learned that forgiveness sometimes meant forgiving himself for not knowing what to do sooner. Years later, when people asked Brielle what had helped her heal, she never mentioned the therapists, the specialists, or the fortune her father spent trying to save her. She always remembered the same thing. A man sitting quietly outside a locked door. A man who never demanded that she speak. A man who simply stayed. Before we reach the final moment, leave a meaningful comment telling us what you believe the greatest lesson of this story is. Is it the power of patience, the courage to stay, the importance of forgiveness, or the hope that even the most wounded heart can heal? Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't saying the perfect words. Sometimes it is sitting beside someone in their silence and letting them know they don't have to suffer alone. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And as the afternoon sunlight settled over the garden, Brielle stood beneath the flowering tree and watched the bluebird on the wooden house sway gently in the breeze. Callum stood nearby with Elsie, Everett stood beside his daughter, and for the first time in many years, the enormous mansion behind them no longer felt empty. It finally felt like home. Not because the house had become richer. Not because the pain had disappeared. But because the people inside it had finally learned something money could never buy, that love is not always about rescuing someone from their brokenness. Sometimes love is simply refusing to walk away while they find their way back. And sometimes, the person who stays long enough to heal your heart is the person you never noticed standing beside you.